I was sick and alone when I heard them laughing in the next room about my funeral, as if I were already gone. The sound cut through the thin wall like knives, each chuckle pounding in my chest harder than the fever burning in my body. They thought I was asleep, too weak to hear, too useless to matter. But every word reached me, clear as daylight. My name is Samuel Price. I'm 78 years old, and my body may have grown frail, but my memory is sharp, sharper than they ever imagined. That night, lying in my bed with the medicine bottle half empty on the nightstand, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. My own son David and his wife Angela, whispering in cruel tones about whether my funeral would be cheap or expensive, whether anyone would even bother to show up. Angela laughed loudest. "Don't worry, David. Old men like him don't last long. We'll save the nice flowers for someone who deserves them." And David, my boy, the one I carried on my shoulders when he was little, he didn't defend me. He laughed too. A soft, guilty laugh that still managed to slice me open. I stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks like I'd done 1,000 nights since moving into their house. I thought of the decades I spent breaking my back in steel factories, the nights I came home with my hands blistered, my lungs blackened by dust, just so David could eat well, go to school, and wear clean clothes. I thought of the winters when I skipped meals so he could have a warm coat, and the summers when I worked double shifts while other men rested. All those years, I never asked for thanks. I only asked for respect. And here I was, being mocked like a burden, a corpse in waiting. It wasn't just the words. It was the sound of their comfort, the clinking of Angela's wine glass, the careless way David exhaled, the television murmuring in the background. They were living as if my absence was already a blessing, as if my funeral was the freedom they were waiting for. I turned my face to the wall, feeling the sting in my chest. Not from sickness, but from betrayal. But what they didn't know, what they never even considered, was that I still held something they had forgotten. And as their laughter filled the night, I felt the weakness in my body harden into something else, an ember of resolve I thought I had lost forever. The laughter lingered long after the voices in the next room quieted, echoing inside me like a cruel hymn. I lay there with my hands pressed against my chest, not sure if the ache came from my illness or from the sting of their betrayal. Every breath felt heavier, every heartbeat slower, as if my own body was listening to their words and agreeing with them, that maybe I was already halfway gone. And yet, something inside me refused to surrender. The wound wasn't in my lungs or my bones. It was in my heart, and it cut deeper than any sickness could. I remembered when David was small, no older than 8, shivering in bed on a night the heater had broken. I had wrapped him in my coat, stayed awake until dawn to keep watch over his breathing, whispering promises that he would never know the cold alone. Back then, his trust was absolute. His little fingers clung to mine as though I was the only light he had in a dark world. To hear him now, groan, mocking the man who kept those promises, it was like watching that little boy die in front of me, replaced by a stranger who carried only my last name. Angela's voice stung even more. She had once looked me in the eye and called me Dad, pretending to care as she served me tea when David first brought her home. I believed her warmth, believed her kindness. Now she sounded like a spectator at a show, planning my funeral as if it were entertainment. Their cruelty wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was the truth, raw and unveiled. The way people speak when they forget you're listening. And the truth was, in their eyes, I was already dead. The medicine bottle rattled when I lifted it, my hand trembling not from fever but from rage I could no longer disguise. I stared at those pills, little white lies I swallowed every morning to keep myself going. For the first time, I wondered if living on like this was worth it. But then another thought arrived, clear and sharp. They wanted me to vanish quietly, to fade into the silence of a grave. And that alone was reason enough to fight, not out of spite, but out of dignity, because a father may age, may falter, but he is not disposable, not while breath still fills his lungs. I turned toward the window. The night was heavy, stars hidden behind clouds, but I imagined Antonia's face there, my late wife, her voice reminding me of the man I used to be, the man who never gave up, no matter how hard the blows came. That voice steadied me. The knife in my heart still twisted, but now it sparked something else. Resolve. I whispered into the dark, barely able to hear myself, yet knowing the words would stay. Not yet. Not the way you expect. And as the house fell silent, I understood that tomorrow would not be about sickness anymore. Tomorrow would be about survival and about reminding them who I still was. My name is Samuel Price. I'm 78 years old, and though my back is bent and my hands shake when I reach for a glass of water, I carry within me the weight of a lifetime. These wrinkles, these calluses, these scars, every mark on my skin is proof that I live not for myself, but for the family whose voices now echo against me like stones. They see only an old man wasting away in their spare room, but I remember everything. And memory is power. I wasn't always like this, thin, tired, forgotten. Once I was the man people called reliable, the one who showed up before dawn at the steel mill, rain or snow, and stayed until the machine stopped roaring. For nearly 5 decades I worked, my lungs filled with dust, my bones aching from the cold iron I carried. When others clocked out, I stayed longer, because I knew there was always another bill waiting, another pair of shoes my son would outgrow, another meal that had to be on the table. I never complained, not out loud. Men of my time didn't. We endured, because endurance was our language of love. David grew up in a house that smelled of sweat and metal, but also of warm bread and Sunday stew. He had new pencils for school, clean shirts for church, and a roof that never leaked because I patched it with my own 2 hands. Angela, if she ever cared to ask, might have known that the chair she sits on in the dining room was bought with the money I earned on my knees, scraping steel shavings off factory floors. Nothing in this house was free. Every brick was built with sacrifice, every corner polished with the hours I gave away. I carry those years in my body. I carry them in the deep lines carved across my forehead, in the stiffness of my knees, in the tremor of my hands. And I thought that carrying them would mean something, that my son would see me and remember. But all he sees now is a man too weak to argue, too old to fight back. He doesn't know that memory itself is a weapon, and I have never forgotten who I am. Tonight, as the fever ebbed and my breath steadied, I realized something simple. They may own the laughter, but I own the years. They cannot take that from me, and when the time comes, and it will, I'll remind them that the man they mock for being old was once the man who made them possible. The question now is not whether I will survive this illness, but whether they can survive the truth I still hold in my hands. When I close my eyes, the memories come back sharp, as if time itself wants to remind me of the price I paid. I see the long nights when I left the mill with my shirt soaked through, the sweat mixing with steel dust until my skin burned. I remember walking home with boots so worn they barely held together, but still carrying a bag of groceries in each hand so David would never go hungry. I can still hear the sound of his small feet running across the kitchen floor to greet me, his laughter ringing in my ears like music. Those were the moments that made every ache worth it. There were winters when the pipes froze, and I worked 3 shifts back to back just to keep the furnace running. Summers when I patched roofs under the burning sun, my back breaking as I hammered shingles, while David played in the shade with a toy truck I had bought him instead of buying myself new shoes. I sold my wedding ring after Antonia passed, not because I wanted to, but because the rent was due and I swore no one would take her house from us. I swallowed pride more times than I can count, nodding at foremen who barked at me like I was nothing, because I knew my son needed me to endure. Even Angela, years ago, benefited from those sacrifices. I remember when she and David first came to me for help with their down payment. She called me Dad back then, her voice sweet, her smile wide. I gave them what I had. Money I had been saving for medicine I knew I'd need one day. I told myself it was worth it to see them happy. And now, that same woman laughs about my funeral in the next room. The truth is, a man's life is built from small, quiet choices that no one applauds. Nobody thanks you for waking up before dawn, for staying late when the machines break, for eating less so your child can eat more. Nobody claps when you give up your dreams to keep another person's dreams alive. But every one of those sacrifices leaves a scar, and those scars tell the real story. My body is a ledger of debts paid in full, and yet, the ones who owe the most look at me like I am empty. As I lay there, the weight of all those years pressed down on me, heavier than the blankets covering my chest. My heart ached not from regret, but from the knowledge that they had forgotten the truth. They think I am powerless because I am sick. They think my years mean nothing because they only see wrinkles and silence. But every sacrifice has its memory, and memory has its consequences. And if they believe I will leave this world quietly, they have learned nothing from the man who raised them. The words that night were not whispers of concern, but mockery sharpened into blades. I lay there, half hidden in shadow, when I heard Angela's voice first, high and careless. If we keep it simple, a pine casket will do. He won't be around to notice. David chuckled under his breath, the kind of laugh that carried guilt but no resistance. He didn't defend me. He didn't stop her. He just let her words hang in the air like smoke, filling the house I once built with contempt. Angela went on, each sentence heavier than the last. Why waste money on flowers? He never cared for them anyway. A cheap arrangement, something small, and then we move on. My throat tightened as if her words were hands pressing down, silencing me. I wanted to rise, to shout, to remind them that I was still alive in the next room, but my body, weak with fever, betrayed me. All I could do was listen, helpless and invisible, while they planned the day I was to disappear. David's silence hurt worse than her cruelty. The boy I once wrapped in my coat during cold nights, the young man I cheered for at his first job interview, now stood by as his wife mocked my death like it was a household chore. And when he finally spoke, it was not to defend me, but to agree. "You're right," he murmured. "Better to keep it simple. He wouldn't want us to spend too much." His words, meant to sound practical, landed like nails sealing a coffin that had not yet been built. I pressed my hands against the mattress, as if the fabric could anchor me to life itself. Every laugh, every careless phrase, drove deeper the certainty that to them I was already gone, nothing more than a shadow passing through their home. My chest rose and fell with anger, with sorrow, with disbelief. They were not waiting for me to get better. They were waiting for me to die. And yet, even as the knife twisted deeper, another truth burned inside me. Their mistake wasn't in laughing too loud or speaking too freely. Their mistake was forgetting that I could still hear, still breathe, still think. They forgot that the man they dismissed as half dead still had strength left in him, not in his body, but in his will. I closed my eyes, letting their laughter echo one last time. If they believed they were free of me, they would soon learn that a father's silence can carry more weight than their cruelest words. For years I had let them believe I was fragile, too weak to stand on my own, too tired to resist. I moved slowly, spoke softly, and let my silences stretch long enough for them to mistake them for confusion. To David and Angela, I was no longer Samuel Price, the man who once bent steel with his hands. I was only a shadow in the corner, someone they could dismiss, someone easy to control. And I let them believe it, because sometimes the greatest strength a man can carry is the mask of weakness. They thought I didn't notice when Angela slid the bank letters into her purse before I could read them. They thought I didn't catch the way David avoided my eyes whenever talk of money came up. They believed I was blind to their late-night whispers, their plans that twisted around my absence as if it were already certain. I said nothing. I let them laugh. I let them underestimate me, because I knew that when people grow too comfortable in their deceit, they show their true faces, and once a mask slips, it never fits the same again. In their minds, I was a burden, a sick old man who needed reminding to take his pills, who asked the same questions twice, who couldn't hear well if the television was too loud. They never saw that I was listening more closely than ever, storing every careless word, every sigh of impatience, every glance they thought I missed. They saw weakness, but I was recording everything, quietly, patiently, like a man sharpening a blade in the dark. Even my cough, the one that rattled through the house at night, worked in my favor. They thought it meant the end was close. They didn't realize it only meant I was counting the days, marking the hours until the right moment would come, the moment when the mask would fall, and the man they thought was gone would stand in front of them with truth in his hands. I stared at myself in the mirror that morning, the reflection pale and thin, but my eyes still burned with life. I saw the man who had fought through hunger, who had buried his wife and still stood tall, who had worked double shifts with blistered hands so his son could have shoes without holes. That man was not gone. He was waiting beneath the mask, and the longer they believed I was broken, the sweeter the moment of revelation would be. They laughed about my funeral because they thought weakness meant defeat. What they never understood was that weakness, when worn carefully, can be the most dangerous disguise of all. They could laugh about my funeral all they wanted, but there was one truth they had forgotten, a truth sealed in paper and ink, resting quietly in a drawer they never bothered to open. The deed, the very foundation of this house, the roof over their heads, the walls they filled with their cruel laughter, still bore my name. It had never been transferred, never signed away. Every brick and every nail was mine, and by law, so was the ground beneath their feet. I remembered the day I first held that document. Antonia was still alive then, her hand resting on my arm as the clerk slid the folder across the counter. She smiled, proud, and whispered that no matter what storms life brought, we would always have a place of our own. I never imagined that someday those same papers would become my shield, my last proof that I wasn't as powerless as my son believed. For years, I kept them safe, folded neatly, tucked in a blue folder with other records of a life built through sweat and sacrifice. David never asked about it. Angela never wondered. They assumed time had stripped me of everything. They assumed wrong. That night, as they joked about caskets and flowers, I thought of the folder hidden only a few steps away. My fingers tingled with the urge to rise from the bed, to hold it again, to remind myself that the house they claimed as theirs was never theirs at all. Weak as I was, I stayed still. Let them laugh, let them believe, because the power of that forgotten deed wasn't in waving it in their faces. It was in keeping it close until the moment came to use it. I closed my eyes and imagined the look on David's face when the truth surfaced, the shame that would burn in Angela's voice when she realized her roof, her comforts, her sense of ownership, all hung on a man they had already buried in their hearts. The thought steadied me, cooled the fever raging through my veins. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control return. They thought sickness had taken everything from me. They thought laughter could bury me before the earth did. But in the silence of that room, with the deed waiting in the shadows, I understood that the battle hadn't even begun. And when it did, I would not be the one left powerless. The deed was only part of what they had forgotten. What neither David nor Angela ever suspected was that I had prepared something even stronger, something written in ink and sealed with the weight of law. My will. It sat folded in a separate envelope, hidden in a drawer they never thought to open. Drafted years ago when Antonia was still with me. At the time, I thought of it as a quiet promise to her, a safeguard for the grandchildren we dreamed of. But now, in the face of their contempt, It had become something else, a shield, and perhaps even a sword. I had updated it not long after moving into their home, when I began to notice the impatience in David's eyes and the sharpness in Angela's tongue. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the years teaching me to never leave loose ends. In that document, I made my wishes clear. Nothing would pass to David if he ever treated me without dignity. Everything, this house, the small savings left in the bank, even the watch Antonia gave me on our wedding day, would skip his name entirely and go straight to the grandchildren. It was a decision I never spoke aloud, a truth I carried in silence while pretending not to notice his growing disdain. As I lay in bed listening to their laughter that night, I thought about that envelope. I imagined David's face when the time came and he realized the inheritance he had been waiting for was never meant for him. I could see Angela's smirk falter when she learned that her clever remarks about my funeral had cost her family more than she could measure. That will was more than paper. It was proof that even in silence, I had seen their hearts clearly, and I had acted. The knowledge gave me strength. They believed they had stripped me of everything, reduced me to a sick old man waiting for death. But they didn't know that I still held the pen that could shape what came after. Their mistake was forgetting that dignity cannot be stolen. It can only be surrendered. And I had not surrendered. I reached for the glass of water by my bedside, my hand trembling but steady enough to drink. For the first time in days, the water tasted clean, not because my body was healed, but because my spirit had found something to hold on to again. The will was hidden, the deed was safe, and my silence was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man who knows he still holds the final word. And when the day came, they would learn that even the weak can decide the weight of the future. The next morning, I rose earlier than usual, the fever still clinging to my skin, but my mind sharper than it had been in weeks. The house was quiet. David had left for work, and Angela was still asleep upstairs. For the first time in a long time, I felt the freedom of silence. No laughter, no cutting remarks, just the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old floor beneath my feet. I moved slowly, carefully, until I reached the drawer where my papers were kept. There it was, the blue folder with the deed, the envelope with my will, and a handful of letters I had kept through the years. My hands shook as I touched them, not from weakness, but from the weight of what they represented. These were my weapons, my proof, my voice when they tried to silence me. I laid everything out on the table and began to organize them, one by one, as if preparing for battle. I took out a small notebook that had long been buried beneath the papers. Inside were records I had kept for decades. Every payment made on the house, every bank transaction I had overseen, every note from the days I worked double shifts. Each line was a reminder that nothing in my life had been handed to me. I had built it, earned it, preserved it, and now I was going to protect it. When Angela finally came downstairs, she barely glanced at me before heading to the kitchen. "Did you take your pills?" she asked without looking up, her voice sharp as ever. I nodded, sliding the folder back into place before she could notice. Let her think I was still the helpless old man. The less she knew, the stronger I remained. Pretending ignorance had become my greatest ally. That afternoon, I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years, Robert Hanley, a retired notary who once worked alongside me at the mill. His voice was rough, aged, but steady. When I told him I needed his help, he didn't ask questions. "Bring me what you have," he said. "We'll make sure it's all in order." The relief I felt at those words was like air filling my lungs after being held under water. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I spent the rest of the evening writing letters, one to my granddaughter Lily, another to my grandson Paul. I didn't say everything, not yet. Just words of love, reminders that their grandfather was still here, still thinking of them, still holding on to the truth. My hand cramped, but I pushed through, because those words were more important than any medicine I could swallow. By the time the sun went down, I was exhausted, but a different kind of exhaustion. The kind that comes not from despair, but from purpose. They thought they were waiting for my funeral. They didn't know I was preparing for my survival. And more than that, I was preparing for their reckoning. 2 days later, Robert Hanley met me at the small diner near the edge of town. He walked in with his cane, his shoulders bent from years of labor, but his eyes still sharp behind thick glasses. When he saw me sitting in the corner booth, he gave a short nod, the kind men of our generation used, instead of hugs. I slid the blue folder across the table, my hand steady despite the pounding of my heart. He opened it slowly, reading each line with care, humming under his breath the way he always did when something serious was on his mind. When he finally looked up, his voice carried a weight I had both dreaded and longed to hear. "Sam, this deed is solid. The house is yours, without question, and the will—" He tapped the sealed envelope with 2 fingers. "If anything happens to you, it speaks louder than their laughter ever could. You've done more than protect yourself. You've already decided the future." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. For weeks, I had felt cornered, powerless, as though my life and dignity were slipping through my fingers. But now, hearing Robert confirm what I already suspected, I felt something awaken in me. Control, proof, truth. All the things David and Angela believed I had lost were sitting there in black and white. Robert leaned closer. "You understand what this means, don't you? If they try to push you, if they try to take more, you don't have to fight them with words. You've already won on paper." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "But if you want, we can make it even stronger. I can notarize a copy, file it officially, make sure no one can touch it." I nodded, my voice quiet but firm. "Do it. I've been quiet too long." As he gathered the papers, I caught sight of my reflection in the diner's window. For the first time in months, the man staring back at me didn't look defeated. He looked older, yes, worn by life, but there was fire in his eyes again. A reminder that weakness was never the absence of strength. It was often the pause before it returned. When I returned home that afternoon, Angela barely noticed me. She was on the phone, laughing at something I couldn't hear, her voice light and careless. David came in later, tired from work, tossing his jacket on the chair without a word. Neither of them knew the truth I carried inside me, the power now secured with signatures and seals. They still saw me as a dying man. But in reality, I was the one holding the foundation of their lives in my hands. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence was different. It wasn't heavy with despair anymore. It was charged with possibility. They had mocked me, counted me out, planned my end. But soon they would realize that the man they thought finished still had the power to change everything. And when that moment came, their laughter would turn to silence. I returned to the house carrying a truth stronger than any medicine, but I didn't show it. Instead, I slipped back into the same quiet routine, the same shuffle through the hallway, the same tired coughs that made Angela roll her eyes. Let them think I was still fading. Let them believe I had no fight left. Because sometimes the best way to protect power is to hide it under the mask of helplessness. And so I played the fool. At dinner that evening, Angela placed a bowl of soup in front of me without looking up from her phone. "Don't spill it on the table," she muttered, as if I were a child who couldn't hold a spoon. David said nothing. He barely glanced at me as he tore bread apart with his hands, talking instead about bills and plans that didn't include me. I listened, nodding as if I hadn't understood, lowering my eyes so they couldn't see the spark behind them. They thought I was shrinking, when in truth, I was taking notes. They didn't notice how often they spoke about money when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Angela complained about the mortgage, about the car payment, about the groceries. David sighed and mumbled that things would be easier once Dad's gone. He said it like it was nothing, like it was just another item on a list. My chest burned, but I swallowed my anger. I let his words sit, heavy and poisonous, while keeping my face blank. The fool doesn't argue. The fool lets them talk, and I wanted them to keep talking. In those quiet moments, I studied them more than ever. The way Angela always locked the mail drawer, as if I didn't know where the spare key was. The way David avoided my eyes whenever he mentioned the future. The way both of them walked a little taller when I shuffled slower, coughed harder, or asked them to repeat themselves. They thought every weakness they saw was real. They didn't realize every weakness I showed was chosen. Late that night, when the house was asleep, I sat at the edge of my bed with the blue folder tucked safely beneath the mattress. I ran my fingers over the edge of the paper, steadying myself with its weight. They thought I had nothing left. They didn't know I had everything they stood on. I smiled for the first time in weeks, a thin, tired smile, but real. Because playing the fool had given me something no confrontation could, their overconfidence. And one day soon, when the time was right, that overconfidence would be the very thing that destroyed them. I began to test them, quietly, the way a man presses a wound to see how deep it goes. At breakfast, while Angela scrolled through her phone, I asked her what she thought would happen to the house if something ever happened to me. She didn't even look up. "David will handle it," she said flatly, as if the answer were obvious, as if I were already gone. I nodded slowly, hiding the truth in my chest, watching how easily the lie came from her lips. Later that week, I asked David if he remembered the first set of tools I bought him when he was a teenager. He laughed, shaking his head. "Dad, that was ages ago. What matters now is stability. You should be thinking about what you're leaving behind, not what you already gave." The way he said it, the casual tilt of his voice, told me more than his words. He wasn't asking if I was ready to rest. He was measuring how close I was to disappearing. So I pushed a little more. I asked about their plans. If I were gone, would you stay here or move somewhere else? Angela's eyes flickered just for a moment, and then she smiled too quickly. "We'd probably sell this place. Start fresh." My hands tightened around the arms of the chair, but I forced a faint smile, nodding as if her words were nothing more than idle talk. Inside, though, I was memorizing every detail, every twitch, every glance, every crack in the mask. It was strange, watching the people I once called family reveal themselves piece by piece, like pulling threads from a cloth until all that remained was the bare frame. Their greed wasn't hidden anymore. It was stitched into their every word, and the more they believed I was too weak to notice, the bolder they became. They spoke of vacations they couldn't yet afford, of cars they hadn't bought, of debts they pretended didn't exist. Each dream built on the unspoken assumption that I wouldn't be around to stand in their way. But the truth was, every time they exposed themselves, I grew stronger. Not in body. My cough still rattled my chest, my steps still faltered, but in resolve. They thought they were writing my ending, but all they were doing was giving me the ink to write theirs. That night, when I lay down to sleep, I whispered into the darkness, "Keep talking, show me everything." Because every word they carelessly dropped was a seed, and soon, those seeds would bear the bitter fruit of their own undoing. It was the children who made the truth cut deepest. My grandchildren, Lily and Paul, had eyes too young to carry the weight of cruelty, yet I began to notice the shadows of their parents reflected in them. One evening, Lily leaned into Angela's side, pointing toward me as I shuffled into the living room. "Why does Grandpa always look so tired?" she asked, her voice innocent, her tone more curious than unkind. Angela smirked, brushing Lily's hair from her face. "Because old men don't have much left to give." They both laughed, softly, like it was nothing. But Lily's eyes lingered on me, searching, learning. Paul, only 7, had once run to me with open arms, his little hands gripping my knees like I was the strongest man alive. But now, when David called me useless under his breath, I caught Paul repeating the word later while playing with his toy soldiers. "This one's useless," he said, tossing a small figure aside. He didn't look at me when he said it, but the echo was unmistakable. Children copy what they hear, what they see. And I realized with a sick heaviness that the poison wasn't stopping with David and Angela. It was seeping into the next generation. I wanted to reach for them, to tell them stories of who I once was. I wanted to show them the calluses still etched into my palms, to remind them that their grandfather once built bridges, welded steel, carried the weight of men twice his size. But every time I opened my mouth, David's voice filled the room first, drowning me out with casual dismissals. "Don't bother him," he'd say to the kids. "He needs to rest." And the children, trusting their father, would nod, their eyes drifting back to their games, leaving me in silence. That silence was heavier than any cough, heavier than any fever. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what they were teaching the children. That respect ends when the wrinkles begin, that love expires when usefulness fades. I couldn't let that be the lesson they carried into their lives. I couldn't let them believe that a father's worth dies before his body does. One evening, as Paul slipped past my chair, I caught his hand gently. He looked up at me, startled, his toy still clutched in his fist. "You know," I whispered, my voice raspy but steady. "This old man once carried steel beams taller than this house, and I never dropped a single one." His eyes widened, a flicker of awe cutting through the haze of his father's words. He didn't reply, just nodded and ran off. But that small spark reminded me that even in poisoned soil, truth can still take root. As I sat back, the ache in my chest deepened, not from sickness, but from the weight of legacy. My fight was no longer just about survival. It was about what those children would remember when they looked back at their grandfather's life. And I swore to myself, with every shallow breath I drew, that they would not remember a man who gave in to silence. The night it happened, the fever in my body wasn't the only thing burning. I felt the fire in my chest turn into something sharper, heavier, uncontainable. I had endured their smirks, their whispers, their jokes about my funeral. I had stayed quiet while they treated me like a ghost in my own house. But everyone has a limit, and mine came when I heard David's voice through the thin wall, colder than any winter I had ever survived. "We'll be free once he's gone," he said. "No more medicine, no more bills, no more dead weight." Angela laughed, adding, "Then we can finally sell this place and start over. His time's almost up anyway." My hands clenched the blanket so tightly my knuckles ached. I wanted to believe I had misheard, that stress had twisted their words into cruelty. But then David spoke again, and his words crushed every last doubt I had. "I just hope it doesn't drag on. It'd be easier if it happened quickly." Something inside me snapped. It wasn't loud or violent. It was silent, like a rope breaking deep inside, releasing years of patience I no longer had. The breaking point wasn't when they mocked me. It wasn't even when they planned my funeral. It was when my own son wished for my end, not out of mercy, but out of convenience. I sat up in bed, the room spinning around me, sweat running down my back. For a moment, I could barely breathe, but the rage steadied me. My feet touched the floor, trembling but firm enough to carry me. I walked to the dresser, opened the drawer, and pulled out the blue folder. My hands shook as I held it, but not from weakness. This time it was from resolve. I laid the folder open on my lap and stared at the papers, the deed, the will, the receipts of years spent holding this family together. My name was there in bold ink, proof that I had never been powerless, proof that the man they mocked still had the power to decide what happened next. As I sat in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, I realized something that changed everything. The fight wasn't about staying alive a few more months or years. The fight was about leaving this world on my terms, not theirs. The breaking point had arrived, and it didn't destroy me. It woke me up. I closed the folder carefully, sliding it back under the mattress. My body was frail, but my spirit was steel again. They thought my silence meant surrender. They thought my sickness meant defeat. But they would soon learn that silence, when it finally breaks, can be louder than any shout. The next morning, the house smelled of coffee and burnt toast. Angela's voice drifted from the kitchen, sharp and impatient, while David clattered dishes like a man preparing for another day he thought belonged to him. I sat at the table in silence, my hands folded in my lap, letting them think I was too tired to speak. Inside, though, I had already decided. The time for silence had ended. The first move had to be made. When David left for work, Angela disappeared upstairs to get ready. I seized the moment. My legs trembled as I stood, but each step felt steadier than the last. I went to my room, lifted the mattress, and pulled out the folder. For a long moment, I held it against my chest, feeling its weight like a heartbeat. Then I placed it carefully into the old leather satchel I once carried to the mill. That bag, worn and cracked, had held my lunch and my tools for years. Now it held my future. By noon, I was on the bus heading across town. Every bump in the road rattled my bones, but I didn't let go of that satchel. The driver glanced at me in the mirror, maybe wondering what business a frail old man had in the city. He didn't know I was carrying proof that I was still more than they believed. When the bus stopped, I stepped onto the cracked pavement and walked straight toward Robert Hanley's small office above the hardware store. He greeted me with the same steady handshake he'd given me decades ago, when we worked side by side. "You ready?" he asked, eyes narrowing as he saw the bag in my hands. I nodded and laid everything on his desk: the deed, the will, the receipts. He examined each one with the care of a man who understood what they meant. Finally, he looked up and said, "Samuel, once we sign and file these, no one, not David, not Angela, not anyone, can touch what's yours." The words steadied me like steel under weak beams. Together we signed, stamped, and sealed. The papers no longer lived only in my drawer. They now lived in the records of the county, beyond their reach, beyond their tricks. My life's work, my home, my dignity, all secured by my own hand. As I left the office, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, I breathed deeply without the taste of bitterness. The first move had been made, quiet and simple, but decisive. They still thought I was lying in that bed, waiting to fade. But in truth, I had already stepped beyond their plans. And when they discovered what I had done, it would be too late for them to undo it. When I returned home that evening, the house was dim, the curtains half drawn, the television humming in the background. Angela glanced at me as I walked in, her eyes narrowing for a second as if she wondered where I had been. I moved slowly, deliberately, clutching the railing as though every step was a battle. I let her believe I was weaker than I truly was. That was the strategy now. Silence. Silence that concealed strength. Silence that gave me room to act while they dismissed me as harmless. At dinner, David asked where I'd been. His tone was casual, but there was suspicion in the way he studied me. I spooned a bit of soup into my bowl and answered with a smile, too faint to challenge him. "Just a walk," I murmured, my voice rough. He accepted the lie with a shrug, already convinced I wasn't capable of more. That was exactly what I wanted. The more they underestimated me, the more room I had to maneuver. In the following days, I kept to myself. I stayed in my room longer, coughed louder, walked slower. I asked for help with simple tasks, letting them feel superior, letting them relax into their arrogance. But when the house was quiet, when the children were asleep and Angela was on the phone with her sister, I would take out my notebook and write. Page after page, I recorded everything I heard, every cruel word, every plan to sell the house, every laugh that echoed from the kitchen when they thought I couldn't hear. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building a record, a testament to their betrayal. Sometimes, at night, I'd hear them whisper, "It won't be long," Angela would say, her voice hushed. "We'll finally be free of him." David rarely answered, but the silence that followed told me enough. They were waiting for death like it was a payday. What they didn't know was that while they counted the days, I was turning each one into evidence. Evidence that would outlive my body. Evidence that would speak even if I couldn't. Silence became my armor. Every smile I gave, every nod, every moment I let them believe I was too fragile to notice was another stone added to the wall I was building between us. They thought I was disappearing. In truth, I was preparing. And the beauty of silence is that it gives no warning. It only breaks when it is most needed. One day, when the time was right, my silence would shatter, and the noise it made would be louder than all their laughter combined. It happened on a Thursday, when the air outside was heavy with rain and the house carried the stale smell of damp clothes. I was in my chair by the window, the blue folder no longer hidden under the mattress but resting quietly in my lap. For weeks I had waited, letting them believe I was fading, letting their arrogance grow roots. But patience only carries a man so far. That day, the time for silence ended. It was time for the revelation. Angela was the first to notice. She walked into the living room with her phone in hand, ready to complain about another bill. Her eyes froze on the folder. "What's that?" she asked, her tone sharp. Defensive, as though she already knew it was something she couldn't control. I looked at her calmly, my voice steady. "This is the house you sit in, the house you laugh in, the house you think belongs to you, but it doesn't." David appeared a moment later, his tie loosened, his expression tired from work. When he saw the papers spread across the table, his face drained of color. "Dad, what are you doing?" he stammered. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the deed. "What I should have done long ago, reminding you that everything under this roof, every nail, every brick, is still mine. It always has been." Angela scoffed, but the sound cracked at the edges. "You're sick. You don't know what you're saying." I opened the will, sliding it across the table toward them. "I know exactly what I'm saying, and this proves it. When the time comes, nothing will pass to you. It goes to Lily and Paul. Not a cent, not a wall, not even the soil in the yard will ever have your names on it." David's jaw clenched, his hands trembling as he reached for the papers, but I pulled them back before he could touch them. "Don't," I warned. "These aren't yours to hold, just like this house was never yours to claim." His eyes darted to Angela, then back to me, his voice low, strained. "Why would you do this to your own son?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "Because my son wished for my death in the next room. Because my son laughed while his wife planned my funeral. Because respect was buried long before I ever will be." The words landed heavier than any shout could. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Angela shifted uncomfortably, for once without a remark to throw. I closed the folder with deliberate care, my hands steady despite the tremor in my bones. "You wanted me gone. You wanted to profit from my silence. Now you'll live with the truth that silence can speak louder than laughter. And this house, this legacy, will never belong to you." For the first time in years, I watched David lower his head like a boy caught in the act, his arrogance stripped bare. Angela turned away, her lips pressed tight. The revelation was not in shouting, not in fury. It was in the weight of truth, undeniable and final. And as the storm broke outside, rain slapping hard against the glass, I knew that from this day forward, the balance of power in this house had changed forever. The storm outside had passed by morning, but the storm inside the house was only beginning. David barely looked at me when he left for work, his steps hurried. His tie knotted too tight around his throat. Angela paced the kitchen for hours, her voice rising and falling in phone calls she thought I couldn't hear. "He's bluffing," she hissed once. "He doesn't have the strength to follow through." But her words wavered, thin and brittle, and I could hear the fear underneath them. Panic has a sound. It cracks the air like glass under pressure. That evening, when David returned, I watched the two of them huddled in the dining room, whispering furiously. Their voices carried just enough for me to catch fragments. "We can't let this ruin everything," Angela said. David muttered something about lawyers, but his voice shook. I didn't move, didn't interrupt. I sat in my chair by the window, staring at the fading light, letting their worry grow louder with every passing minute. It was almost poetic. The same mouths that had once mocked my funeral were now dry with fear of losing the very ground beneath their feet. Later, David came into the living room, his face pale, his hands restless. "Dad," he began, his voice forced into calmness. We think it's time we talk things through. Maybe we can reach an understanding." I looked at him, steady and unblinking. "An understanding?" I asked. "When you wished for my death, was that your understanding? When you laughed at my funeral, was that your way of reaching me?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked down, ashamed, though I wasn't sure if it was shame for what he'd done or fear of what he might lose. Angela tried next. She placed a cup of tea on the table in front of me, her smile strained, her eyes darting. "We've all said things we don't mean," she whispered. "Families fight, but you don't want to cause trouble for everyone, do you?" I picked up the cup, my hand steady despite the trembling in my bones. "The trouble," I said, "didn't begin with me. It began the moment you forgot that respect keeps a family alive longer than blood ever can." They fell quiet after that, whispering again only when they thought I had gone to bed. But I could hear it. Panic in their voices, panic in their hurried footsteps, panic in the silence that followed when neither could find a solution. They had mocked me as powerless. Now their fear was proof that power had never left me. I lay in bed that night listening to the house creak and groan under the weight of their unease. For the first time in years, I felt no fear of my own, because panic had shifted. It no longer lived in me. It lived in them. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of people walking on cracked glass. David avoided me, his once confident stride reduced to shuffling footsteps that carried him past my chair without a word. Angela tried to keep up her sharp remarks, but even her voice had softened, each syllable laced with caution. Their panic had curdled into something else, respect, though unwilling, dragged from them by fear. I sat quietly, not as a man defeated, but as a father reclaiming ground he had never truly lost. Every time I looked around the house, I saw pieces of myself in it, the railing I had polished smooth with years of use, the kitchen tiles I had laid one by one, the garden I had planted for Antonia when she dreamed of roses outside the window. This house was more than shelter. It was my life poured into brick and mortar, and no amount of laughter, no amount of greed could erase that truth. One evening, David finally sat across from me at the table. He didn't bring papers or demands. He brought only his hollow eyes and the weight of words he struggled to say. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking, I went too far." He looked down, his hands twisting together. "I was angry. I was tired. I didn't mean all of it." I listened, letting the silence stretch long before I answered. "Son," I said slowly, "anger doesn't plan a man's funeral. Tiredness doesn't wish for his death. Those things come from somewhere deeper." His face crumpled, but I didn't let my own soften. A father's love is deep, but dignity is deeper. Without it, love rots into chains. Angela joined him a moment later, her lips pressed thin. She didn't apologize, not with words. Instead, she muttered about the children, about how they needed stability, how we all needed to move forward. I looked at her, then back at David, and spoke the only truth that mattered. "I am not your burden. I am not your obstacle. I am your father, and if you can't give me respect, then you'll learn to live without my forgiveness." The room was heavy, their silence loud, their faces pale. For once, they understood. My dignity wasn't something they could take. It was something I had always carried, even when they tried to bury it beneath laughter. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I thought of Lily and Paul. I thought of the lesson I wanted them to carry, that a man's worth is not measured by his weakness, but by his refusal to bow when others try to strip him of his name. The house creaked with the weight of that truth, and I knew then that the battle was almost done. But not the story, not yet, because dignity was mine, but consequence was still waiting for them. The final turn came quietly, without shouting, without slammed doors. It was late evening when David and Angela sat in the living room, their voices low, their faces pale with the weight of all that had changed. They had mocked me, plotted around me, laughed at the thought of my death. But now their eyes could not meet mine, because they knew the truth. The man they dismissed still held the final word. I rose slowly from my chair, leaning on the armrest, every movement deliberate. My body ached, but my spirit was steady. I placed the blue folder on the table one last time, not to prove anything, but to remind them of what they had forgotten. "This house," I said softly, my voice carrying more power than any shout, "was built by my hands. My sweat sealed the walls. My labor kept the lights on. My sacrifices gave you a life. And yet you thought I was nothing." David's lips parted, but no words came. Angela stared at the floor, her arms crossed tight, as if holding herself together. I continued, each word measured. "You wanted me gone. You wished for my funeral. But death does not arrive on your terms. Not while I still breathe. Not while I still hold the name written on these papers. You forgot that." The room was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. In that silence, I felt the weight shift, the balance restored. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one shrinking. They were. I closed the folder gently, slid it back into my bag, and straightened as much as my back would allow. "You may live in this house," I told them, "but never mistake whose roof it is. Never forget whose name it carries. Respect is the rent you owe, and if you cannot pay it, then walls built by my hands will not shelter you." David lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders trembling with the weight of what he had lost. Not money, not property, but the chance to say he had honored his father. Angela's face was stone, but her silence was louder than any words. They had no defense left. I turned toward the window, the night stretching endless beyond the glass. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Not because I had punished them, but because I had reclaimed what they tried to strip away, my dignity, my legacy, my last word. They had laughed about my funeral as though I were already gone. But I was still here, and so long as I drew breath, the story would be mine to tell, not theirs.